hey everyone, and welcome back to discussion time in your groups. I'm excited to get to join you and guide your discussion yet again this week. And we are mid-November. It's hard to believe in just a few weeks we will launch into the Christmas season and groups will enter a season of rest. I would encourage you to consider what it looks like for you to stay connected to your group over the Christmas season where you will not be meeting formally. What do you need to sustain you through that season from your group? Maybe you desire to have a Christmas party, or hang out informally, or check in over text or phone during the break. I hope that you are forming meaningful relationships, and I want to encourage you and challenge you that they don't need to stay within the bounds of your weekly group meeting time. You can just be together and do life together organically. Here's our warm-up question for today. What is your favorite place in the entire world, and why?
So welcome to Allison and to Ainsley and to Ron. And that's for you. And we'll make sure that the girls get theirs later on this morning. Thank you very much.
Sounds good. Thank you, Melissa.
So this week we are talking about worship. This is the second last week of the series we have been in all fall called Rebuild on the book of Nehemiah. Pastor Oliver shared with us on Nehemiah chapter 12. In this chapter, we see the people working to restore the worship of David in Jerusalem. This was the third week where we have been looking at practices that help us stay in a place of reliance on God so that we continue to build with Him. First, we looked at preaching. And then last week I talked about repentance, which we will unfortunately not have the chance to discuss together. And then this week, worship. Worship is a practice that can help us stay in a place of reliance on God. Now, whenever we talk about worship, it can be a bit of a confusing conversation because worship is a really big category. Oliver shared that all of life can be worship when it is done out of a heart that longs to glorify God. So all of life can be worship. So sometimes when we talk about worship, we mean that broad category. Other times though, we might talk about it in a smaller way. So on Sundays, we come together for a worship service or a worship gathering. That's an hour on a Sunday morning that we dedicate to the worship of God. Everything we do there can be worship. Or you can break it down even smaller. There are different parts of the service: worship, prayer, and sermon. Wait, I thought the whole service was worship. That's where it gets confusing. Sometimes when we talk about worship, we mean specifically worship through music. So what is worship? Well, worship encompasses all of these things. And as Oliver shared about worship, he preached on it with this in mind. There were times when he spoke specifically about worship through music, but he also shared about how worship is meant to be a whole life orientation, that our whole life should be worship as a response to who God is. So let's stop here for a discussion question. I want you to take some time to discuss your experience of worship, your experience in that broad category. Share with your group what it is like for you to worship on a Sunday morning in the worship gathering. What is it like for you participating in that? Maybe you have always been confused and wondered what is going on when we sing together each week. Share that. Share what it looks like for you to live a life of worship. Or maybe share that this is a totally new concept for you. What about what is going on inside of you as you worship? Are you happy, sad, angry? Describe your experience with worship. One of the key ideas that Pastor Oliver shared was that worship follows a pattern. If you remember, there were two words that were key to Oliver's understanding of worship: revelation and response. He talked about how worship follows this pattern of revelation and response. What does that mean? Well, revelation, the act of revealing, is the beginning of worship. God reveals or gives revelation of himself, what he is like and what he does. And then we respond to that. When God reveals himself, revelation, we respond. response. We worship when we respond appropriately to who God has revealed himself to be. So, when we come to a worship gathering on Sunday, we hear some bit of revelation of who God is, and then we respond by praising him. We hear a sermon that unpacks the revelation of God in the Bible, and we respond by worshiping God. And in our lives, we see revelation of God, and we respond by living a life of worship. Pastor Oliver shared with us that this worship, revelation, and response is what life is moving towards. He said this: the climax of the work of God is the worship of God. When it's all said and done, this is what will happen. God will one day reveal himself fully, and we will respond in worship. So I know that's a little bit heady, but remember that worship follows this pattern of revelation and response, and that this worship is the climax of the work of God. All right, now, I always try and make these questions practical. This one's going to be a bit of a stretch, but I hope that this understanding of worship helps you enter into worship in a new way. That as you're understanding that worship is our response to the revelation of God, that you will just be inspired to worship. And so here's what I want you to discuss. How can you enter in more fully to worship, right? What are steps that you can take to enter into worship? What are things that you need to do to be able to place yourself so that when revelation comes, you respond well? What are steps you can take to worship? Well, this brings us to the end of our discussion time today. As a prayer prompt, I want you to consider this question: what keeps you from worshiping? Share with your group things that make it difficult for you to worship, and then pray that Jesus would help you overcome those barriers. And if you have some time before your group ends, consider sharing about the sermon last week where I shared about repentance. I hope to see you next week as we conclude the series Rebuild. Bye for now.